S. Sadism, masochism. Sadisme, masochisme. The terms sadism and masochism were coined by Krafft Ebing in 1893, with reference to the Marquis de Sade and Baron Sacher von Masoch. Krafft Ebing used the terms in a very specific sense to refer to a sexual perversion in which sexual satisfaction is dependent upon inflicting pain or others, sadism, or upon experiencing pain oneself, masochism. When Freud took up the terms in his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, he used them in the same sense as Krafft Ebing. Following Krafft Ebing, Freud posited an intrinsic connection between sadism and masochism, arguing that they are simply the active and passive aspects of a single perversion. Lacan too argues that sadism and masochism are intimately related, both being related to the invocatory drive, which he also calls the sadomasochistic drive. Both the masochist and the sadist locate themselves as the object of the invocatory drive, the voice. However, whereas Freud argues that sadism is primary, Lacan argues that masochism is primary, and sadism is derived from it. Sadism is merely the disavowal of masochism. Thus, whereas the masochist prefers to experience the pain of existence in his own body, the sadist rejects this pain and forces the big other to bear it. Masochism occupies a special place among the perversions, just as the invoking drive occupies a privileged place among the partial drives. It is the limit experience in the attempt to go beyond the pleasure principle. Scene, Szene. Freud borrowed the expression another scene, eine andere Schauplatz, from G.T. Fechner and used it in the interpretation of dreams, stating that the scene of action of dreams is different from that of waking ideational life. This led Freud to formulate the idea of psychical locality. However, Freud emphasized that this concept of locality is not to be confused with physical locality or anatomical locality, and Lacan takes this as a justification for his own use of topology. Lacan makes repeated reference to Fechner's expression in his work. The other scene is, in Lacanian terms, the big other. Lacan also uses the term scene to designate the imaginary and symbolic theater in which the subject plays out his fantasy, which is built on the edifice of the real, the world. The scene of fantasy is a virtual space which is framed in the same way that the scene of a play is framed by the proscenium arch in a theater, whereas the world is a real space which lies beyond the frame. The notion of scene is used by Lacan to distinguish between acting out and passage to the act. The former still remains inside the scene, for it is still inscribed in the symbolic order. The passage to the act, however, is an exit from the scene, is a crossing over from the symbolic to the real. There is a total identification with the object, objectia, and hence an abolition of the subject. The fantasy scene is also an important aspect in perversion. The pervert typically stages his enjoyment in terms of some highly stylized scene and according to his stereotypical script. Schema L. Schema L. The various schemata that begin to appear in Lacan's work in the 1950s are all attempts to formalize by means of diagrams certain aspects of psychoanalytic theory. The schemata all consist of a number of points connected by a number of vectors. Each point in a schema is designed by one of the symbols of Lacanian algebra, while the vectors show the structural relations between these symbols. The schemata can be seen as Lacan's first incursion into the field of topology. The first schema to appear in Lacan's work is also the schema which he makes the most use of it. This schema is designated L because it resembles the uppercase Greek lambda. Lacan first introduces the schema in 1955 and it occupies a central place in his work for the next few years. 2 years later, Lacan replaces this version of the schema with a newer simplified form. Although schema L allows many possible readings, the main point of the schema is to demonstrate that the symbolic relation between the big other and the subject is always blocked to a certain extent by the imaginary axis between the ego and the specular image. Because it has to pass through the imaginary wall of language, the discourse of the begotter reaches the subject in an interrupted and inverted form. See communication. This schema thus illustrates the opposition between the imaginary and the symbolic, which is so fundamental to Lacan's conception of psychoanalysis. This is of practical importance in the treatment, since the analyst must usually intervene in the symbolic register rather than in the imaginary. Thus the schema also shows the position of the analyst in the treatment. If one wants to position the analyst within the schema of the subject's speech, one can say that he is somewhere in capital A. At least he should be. If he enters into the coupling of the resistance, which is just what he is taught not to do, then he speaks from a small a accent and he will see himself in the subject. By positioning different elements in the four empty loci of the schema, schema L can be used to analyze various sets of relations encountered in psychoanalytic treatment. For example, Lacan uses it to analyze the relations between Dora and the other people in her story, and also to analyze the relations between the various people in the case of the young homosexual woman. In addition to providing a map of intersubjective relations, schema L also represents intrasubjective structure insofar as the one can be distinguished from the other. Thus, it illustrates the decentering of the subject, since the subject is not to be located only at the point marked capital S, but over the whole schema. He is stretched over the four corners of the schema. In addition to schema L, there are several other schemata that appear in Lacan's work. See schema R, see capital E, schema I, see capital E, the two schemata of Sade, see EC and EC 778. All of these schemata are transformations of the basic quaternary of schema L on which they are based. However, unlike schema L, which serves as a constant point of reference for Lacan in the period of 1954-1957, each of these schemata only appears once in Lacan's work. By the time the last of these schemata, the schemata of Sade, appear in 1962, the schemata have already ceased to play an important part in Lacan's discourse, although it can be argued that they lay the groundwork for Lacan's more rigorous topological work in the 1970s. School, école. When Lacan founded the École Freudienne de Paris, EFP, in 1964, after his resignation from the Société Franchise de Psychanalyse, SPP, he chose to call it a school for precise reasons. Not only was it the first time that a psychoanalytic organization had been called a school, rather than an association or society, but the term school also highlighted the fact that the EFP was more a means of psychoanalytic formation centered around a doctrine than an institutional order centered around a group of important people. Thus, the very use of the term school in the name of the EFP indicated that it was an attempt to found a very different type of psychoanalytic institution from those which had been founded before. Lacan was particularly keen to avoid the dangers of the hierarchy dominating the institution, which he saw in the International Psychoanalytical Association, IPA, and which he blamed for the theoretical misunderstandings which had come to dominate the IPA. The IPA had become, he argued, a kind of church. However, it is also important to note that Lacan's criticisms of the IPA do not imply a criticism of the psychoanalytic institution per se. While Lacan is very critical of the dangers that beset all psychoanalytic institutions, the fact that he himself founded one is evident that he thought that some kind of institutional framework was necessary for psychoanalysts. Thus Lacan is just as skeptical of those analysts who reject all institutions as he is of those who turn the institution into a kind of church. Many of Lacan's ideas cannot be understood without some understanding of the history of the EFP, especially those of Lacan's ideas which relate to the training of analysts. In this context, it is important to note that the EFP was not merely a training institute and that membership was not restricted to analysts and trainees, but was open to anyone with an interest in psychoanalysis. All members had equal voting rights, which meant that the EFP was the first truly democratic psychoanalytic organization in history. There were 4 categories of members in the EFP: ME, membre de l'école or single member, AP, analyste pratiquant, AME, analyste membre de l'école, and AE, analyste de l'école. Members could and often did hold several titles simultaneously. Those who applied for membership of the school were interviewed by a committee called the Cardo, a word meaning a hinge on which a door turns, before being admitted as an ME. Only the AME and the AE were recognized as analysts by the school, although other members were not forbidden to conduct analysis and could award themselves the title of AP to indicate that they were practicing analysts. The title of AME was granted to members of the school who satisfied a jury of senior members that they had conducted the analysis of 2 patients in a satisfactory manner. In this sense, the category of AME was similar to that of the titular members of other psychoanalytic societies. The title of AE was awarded on the basis of a very different procedures, which Lacan called the pass. The pass was instituted by Lacan in 1967 as a means of verifying the end of analysis, and constitutes the most original feature of the EFP. Another original feature of the EFP was the promotion of research in small study groups known as cartels. The final years of the EFP were dominated by intense controversy over the pass and other issues. In 1980, Lacan dissolved the EFP, and in 1881 he created a new institution in its stead, the École de la Cause Freudienne, ECF. Some of the original members of the EFP followed Lacan into the ECF, whereas others left to set up a variety of other groups. Some of these groups still exist today, as does the ECF. Science. Science. Both Freud and Lacan use the term science in the singular, and thus implying that there is a specific, unified, homogeneous kind of discourse that can be called scientific. This discourse begins, according to Lacan, in the 17th century with the inauguration of modern physics. Freud regarded science, German Wissenschaft, a term which, with markedly different connotations in German, as one of civilization's highest achievements, as opposed it to the reactionary forces of religion. Lacan's attitude to science is more ambiguous. On the one hand, he criticizes modern science for ignoring the symbolic dimension of human existence and thus encouraging modern man to forget his subjectivity. He also compares modern science to a fully realized paranoia, in the sense that its totalizing constructions resemble the architecture of a delusion. On the other hand, these criticisms are not leveled at science per se, but at the positivist model of science. Lacan implies that positivism is actually a deviation from true science, and his own model of science owes more to the rationalism of Coiré, Bachelard, and Canguilhem than to empiricism. In other words, for Lacan, what marks a discourse as scientific is a high degree of mathematical formalization. This is what lies behind Lacan's attempts to formalize psychoanalytic theory in terms of various mathematical formulae. See mathematics, algebra. These formulae also encapsulate a further characteristic of scientific discourse, perhaps the most fundamental one in Lacan's view, which is that it should be transmissible. Lacan argues that science is characterized by a particular relationship to truth. On the one hand, it attempts illegitimately, thinks Lacan, to monopolize truth as its exclusive property, and on the other hand, as Lacan later argues, science is in fact based on a foreclosure of the concept of truth as cause. Science is also characterized by a particular relationship to knowledge, savoir, in that science is based on the exclusion of any access to knowledge by recourse to intuition, and thus forces all the search for knowledge to follow only the path of reason. The modern subject is the subject of science in the sense that this exclusively rational route to knowledge is now a common presupposition. In stating that psychoanalysis operates only the subject of science, Lacan is arguing that psychoanalysis is not based on any appeal to an ineffable experience or flash of intuition, but on a process of reason dialogue, even when reason confronts its limit in madness. Although the distinction between the human sciences and the natural sciences had become quite well established by the end of the 19th century, thanks to the work of Dilthey, It does not figure in Freud's work. Lacan, on the other hand, pays great attention to this distinction. However, rather than talking of the human sciences, a term which Lacan dislikes intensely, and the natural sciences, Lacan prefers instead to talk of the conjectural sciences, or sciences of subjectivity, and the exact sciences, whereas the exact sciences concern the field of phenomena in which there is no one who uses a signifier. The conjectural sciences are fundamentally different because they concern beings who inhabit the symbolic order. In 1965, however, Lacan problematizes the distinction between conjectural and exact sciences. The opposition between the exact sciences and the conjectural sciences can no longer be sustained from the moment when conjecture is susceptible to an exact calculation probability and when exactitude is based only on a formalism which separates axioms and laws of grouping symbols. Whereas in the last century, physics provided a paradigm of exactitude for the exact sciences which made the conjectural sciences seem sloppy by comparison, the arrival on the scene of structural linguistics redressed the imbalance by providing an equally exact paradigm for the conjectural sciences. When Freud borrowed terms from other sciences, it was always from the natural sciences, principally biology, medicine, and thermodynamics, because these were the only sciences around in Freud's day that provided a model of rigorous investigation and thought. Lacan differs from Freud by importing concepts mainly from the sciences of subjectivity, principally linguistics, and by aligning psychoanalytic theory with these rather than with the natural sciences. Lacan argues that this paradigm shift is in fact implicit in Freud's own reformulations of the concepts that he borrowed from the natural sciences. In other words, whenever Freud borrowed concepts from biology, he reformulated those concepts so radically that he created a totally new paradigm which was quite alien to its biological origins. Thus, according to Lacan, Freud anticipated the findings of modern structural linguists such as Saussure, and his work can be better understood in the light of these linguistic concepts. Is psychoanalysis a science? Freud was quite explicit in affirming the scientific status of psychoanalysis. While it was originally the name of a particular therapeutic method, he wrote in 1924, it has now also become the name of a science, the science of unconscious mental processes. However, he also insisted on the unique character of psychoanalysis that sets it apart from the other sciences. Every science is based on observations and experiences arrived at through the medium of our psychical apparatus. But since our science has as its subject that apparatus itself, the analogy ends here. The question of the status of psychoanalysis and its relationship with other disciplines is also one to which Lacan devotes much attention. In his pre-war writings, psychoanalysis is seen unreservedly in scientific terms. However, after 1950, Lacan's attitude to the question becomes much more complex. In 1953, he states that in the opposition science versus art, psychoanalysis can be located on the side of art, on condition that the term art is understood in the sense in which it was used in the Middle Ages, when the liberal arts included arithmetic, geometry, music, and grammar. However, in the opposition science versus religion, Lacan follows Freud in arguing that psychoanalysis has more in common with scientific discourse than religious discourse. Psychoanalysis is not a religion. It proceeds from the same status as science itself. I'll start again. However, in the opposition science versus religion, Lacan follows Freud in arguing that psychoanalysis has more in common with scientific discourse than religious discourse. Psychoanalysis is not a religion. It proceeds from the same status as science itself. If, as Lacan argues, a science is only constituted as such by isolating and defining its particular object of enquiry, see Lacan 1946, where he argues that psychoanalysis has actually set psychology on a scientific footing by providing it with a proper object of enquiry, the imago. Then, when in 1965 he isolates the objet petit a as the object of psychoanalysis, he is in effect claiming a scientific status for psychoanalysis. However, from this point on, Lacan comes increasingly to question this view of psychoanalysis as a science. In the same year, he states that psychoanalysis is not a science but a practice, pratique, with a scientific vocation. Though in the same year he also speaks of the psychoanalytic science, he has become more by 1977, he has become more categorical. Psychoanalysis is not a science, it has no scientific status, it merely waits and hopes for it. Psychoanalysis is a delusion which is expected to produce a science. It is a scientific delusion, but this doesn't mean that analytic practice will ever produce a science. Ornicard. However, even when Lacan makes such statements, he never abandons the project of formalizing psychoanalytic theory in linguistic and mathematical terms. Indeed, the tension between the scientific formalism of the matheme and the semantic profusion of la langue constitutes one of the most interesting features of Lacan's later work. Semblance, semblant. Running throughout Lacan's work is the idea that appearances are deceptive, an idea that is closely connected to the classical philosophical opposition between appearance and essence. The very distinction between the imaginary and the symbolic implies this opposition between appearance and essence. The imaginary is the realm of observable phenomena which act as lures, while the symbolic is the realm of underlying structures which cannot be observed, but which must be deduced. This opposition informs all scientific inquiry, a basic presupposition of which is that the scientist must attempt to penetrate through false appearance into the hidden reality. Similarly, in psychoanalysis as in science, only he who escapes from false appearances can achieve truth. However, false appearance in psychoanalysis is different from false appearance in the natural sciences. For the natural scientist, the false appearance, for example a straight stick that appears to be bent when half submerged in water, lacks the dimension of deliberate deception, which is why Lacan states that the axiom of natural science is the belief in an honest, non-deceitful God. However, in the conjectural sciences and in psychoanalysis, there is always the problem that the falsity of the appearance may be due to deception. Lacan uses two terms to refer to false appearances. The term appearance is that used in philosophical discussions of the distinction between essence and appearance. The term semblant is less technical, but acquires a growing importance in Lacan's work over the years. It appears as early as 1957 and is used several times in the seminar of 1964, but it is not until the early 1970s that the term comes to occupy an important place in Lacan's theoretical vocabulary. At first, Lacan uses the term to refer to such issues as feminine sexuality, which is characterized by a dimension of masquerade, see Rivière. Later on, Lacan uses the term to characterize general features of the symbolic order and its relations to the imaginary and the real. Thus, Lacan devotes his 1971 seminar to a discourse that would not be semblance, in which he argues that truth is not simply the opposite of appearance, but is in fact continuous with it. Truth and appearance are like the two sides of a Möbius strip, which are in fact only one side. In the seminar of 1972-1973, Lacan goes on to state that object pitié is a semblance of being, that love is addressed to a semblance, and that jouissance is only evoked or elaborated on the basis of a semblance. Séminaire. In 1951, Lacan began to give private lectures in Sylvia Bataille's apartment at 3 Rue de Lille. The lectures were attended by a small group of trainee psychoanalysts and were based on readings of some of Freud's case histories. Dora, the Rat Man, and the Wolf Man. In 1953, the venue of these lectures moved to the Hôpital Sainte-Anne, where a larger audience could be accommodated. Although Lacan sometimes refers to the private lectures of 1951-52 and 52-53 as the first 2 years of his seminar, the term is now usually reserved for the public lectures which began in 1953. From that point on until his death in 1981, Lacan took a different theme each academic year and delivered a series of lectures on it. These 27 annual series of lectures are usually referred to collectively as the seminar in the singular. After 10 years at the Hôpital Sainte-Anne, the seminar moved to the École Normale Supérieure in 1964 and to the Faculté de Droit in 1973. These changes of venue were due to various reasons, not least of which was the need to accommodate the constantly growing audience as the seminar gradually became a focal point in the Parisian intellectual resurgence of the 1950s and 1960s. Given Lacan's insistence that speech is the only medium of psychoanalysis, it is perhaps appropriate that the original means by which Lacan developed and expounded his ideas should have been the spoken word. Indeed, as one commentator has remarked, it must be recalled that virtually all of Lacan's writings, écrits, were originally oral presentations, that in many ways the open-ended seminar was his preferred environment. As Lacan's seminars became increasingly popular, demand grew for written transcripts of the seminar. However, apart from a few small articles that he wrote on the basis of some lectures delivered in the course of the seminar, Lacan never published any account of his own seminars. In 1956-1959, Lacan authorized Jean-Bertrand Pontalis to publish a few summaries of sections to the seminar during those years, but this was not enough to satisfy the growing demand for written accounts of Lacan's teaching. Hence, unauthorized transcripts of Lacan's seminar began increasingly to be circulated among his followers in an almost clandestine way. In 1973, Lacan allowed his son-in-law Jacques-Alain Miller to publish an edited transcript of the lectures given in 1964, the 11th year of the seminar. Since then, Miller has continued to bring out edited versions of the other years of the seminar, although the number published is still fewer than half. Miller's role in editing and publishing the seminar has led to some very heated arguments, with opponents claiming he has distorted Lacan's original. However, as Miller himself has pointed out, the transition from an oral to a written medium and the editing required by this means that these published versions of the seminar could never be simple transcripts of the lectures given by Lacan. So far, only 9 of the yearly seminars have been published in book form, while authorized extracts from others have appeared in the Journal Ornicar. Unauthorized transcripts of the unpublished years of the seminar continue to circulate today both in France and abroad. The titles of each year or each book of the seminar are listed on page 177. The original French titles and publications are listed in the bibliography at the end of this dictionary. Sexual difference. The phrase sexual difference, which has come into prominence in the debate between psychoanalysis and feminism, is not part of Freud's or Lacan's theoretical vocabulary. Freud speaks only of the anatomical distinction between the sexes and its psychical consequences. Lacan speaks of sexual position and the sexual relationship, and occasionally of the differentiation of the sexes. However, both Freud and Lacan address the question of sexual difference, and an entry has been included for this term because it brings together an important set of related themes in Lacan's work, and because it constitutes an important focus for feminist approaches to Lacan's work. See Brennan, Gallop, Gross, Mitchell, and Rose. One of the basic presuppositions underlying Freud's work is that just as there are certain physical differences between men and women, so also there are psychical differences. In other words, there are certain psychical characteristics that can be called masculine and others that can be called feminine. Rather than trying to give any formal definition of these terms, an impossible task, Freud limits himself to describing how a human subject comes to acquire masculine or feminine psychical characteristics. This is not an instinctual or natural process, but a complex one in which anatomical differences interact with social and psychical factors. The whole process revolves around the castration complex, in which the boy fears being deprived of his penis, and the girl, assuming that she has already been deprived of hers, develops penis envy. Following Freud, Lacan also engages with the problem of how the human infant becomes a sexed subject. For Lacan, masculinity and femininity are not biological essences but symbolic positions, and the assumption of one of these two positions is fundamental to the construction of subjectivity. The subject is essentially a sexed subject. Man and woman are signifiers that stand for these two subjective positions. For both Freud and Lacan, the child is at first ignorant of sexual difference and so cannot take up a sexual position. It is only when the child discovers sexual difference in the castration complex that he can begin to take up a sexual position. Both Freud and Lacan see this process of taking up a sexual position as closely connected with the Oedipus complex, but they differ on the precise nature of the connection. For Freud, the subject's sexual position is determined by the sex of the parent with whom the subject identifies in the Oedipus Oedipus complex. If the subject identifies with the father, he takes up a masculine position. Identification with the mother entails the assumption of a feminine position. For Lacan, however, the Oedipus complex always involves symbolic identification with the father, and hence Oedipal identification cannot determine sexual position. According to Lacan, then, it is not identification, but the subject's relationship with the phallus which determines sexual position. This relationship can either be one of having or not having. Men have the symbolic phallus and women don't. Or to be more precise, men are not without having it. Ils ne sont pas sans l'avoir. The assumption of a sexual position is fundamentally a symbolic act, and the difference between the sexes can only be conceived of on the symbolic plane. It is insofar as the function of man and woman is symbolized, it is insofar as it's literally uprooted from the domain of the imaginary and situated in the domain of the symbolic, that any normal completed sexual position is realized. However, there is no signifier of sexual difference as such which would permit the subject to fully symbolize the function of man and woman, and hence it is impossible to attain a fully normal finished sexual position. The subject's sexual identity is thus always a rather precarious matter, a source of perpetual self-questioning. The question of one's own sex, am I a man or a woman, is the question which defines hysteria. The mysterious other sex is always the woman for both men and women, and therefore the question of the hysteric, what is a woman, is the same for both male and female hysterics. Although the biology of the subject plays a part in the question of which sexual position the subject will take up, it is a fundamental axiom in psychoanalytic theory that anatomy does not determine sexual position. There is a rupture between the biological aspect of sexual difference, for example at the level of the chromosomes, which is related to the reproductive function of sexuality, and the unconscious, in which this reproductive function is not represented. Given the non-representation of the reproductive function of sexuality in the unconscious, in the psyche there is nothing by which the subject may situate himself as a male or female being. There is no signifier of sexual difference in the symbolic order. The only sexual signifier is the phallus, and there is no female equivalent of the signifier. Strictly speaking, there is no symbolization of woman's sex as such. The phallus is a symbol to which there is no correspondent, no equivalent. It is a matter of dissymmetry in the signifier. Hence the phallus is the pivot which completes in both sexes the questioning of their sex by the castration complex. It is this fundamental dissymmetry in the signifier which leads to the dissymmetry between the Oedipus complex in men and women. Whereas the male subject desires the parent of the other sex and identifies with the parent of the same sex, the female subject desires the parent of the same sex and is required to take the image of the other sex as the basis of its identification. For a woman, the realization of her sex is not accomplished in the Oedipus complex in a way symmetrical to that of man's, not by identification with the mother, but on the contrary by identification with the paternal object, which assigns her an extra detour. This signifying dissymmetry determines the paths down which the Oedipus complex will pass. The two paths make them both pass down the same trail, the trail of castration. If, then, there is no symbol for the opposition masculine-feminine as such, the only way to understand sexual difference is in terms of the opposition activity-passivity. This polarity is the only way in which the opposition male-female is represented in the psyche, since the biological function of sexuality, reproduction, is not represented. This is why the question of what one is to do as a man or a woman is a drama which is situated entirely in the field of the big other, which is to say that the subject can only realize his sexuality on the symbolic level. In the seminar of 1970-1971, Lacan tries to formalize his theory of sexual difference by means of formulae derived from symbolic logic. These reappear in the diagram of sexual difference which Lacan presents in the 1972-1973 seminar. The diagram is divided into two sides, on the left the male side and on the right the female side. The formulae of sexuation appear at the top of the diagram, thus the formulae on the male side. There is at least one X which is not submitted to the phallic function, and for all X, the phallic function is valid. The formula on the female side are there is not one x which is not submitted to the phallic function, and for not all x, the phallic function is valid. The last formula illustrates the relationship of woman to the logic of the not all. What is most striking is that the two propositions on each side of the diagram seem to contradict each other. Each side is defined by both an affirmation and a negation of the phallic function, and inclusion and exclusion of absolute non-phallic jouissance. However, there is no symmetry between the two sides, no sexual relationship. Each side represents a radically different way in which the sexual relationship can misfire. Sexual relationship, rapport sexuel. Lacan first proposes his famous formula, il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel, in 1970, and takes it up again in his seminar of 72-73. This formula is usually translated into English as there is no such thing as a sexual relationship, which is misleading, since Lacan is certainly not denying that people have sex. The formula might better be rendered, there is no relation between the sexes, thus emphasizing that it is not primarily the act of sexual intercourse that Lacan is referring to, but the question of the relation between the masculine sexual position and the feminine sexual position. The formula thus condenses a number of points in Lacan's approach to the question of sexual difference. 1. There is no direct, unmediated relation between the male and female sexual position, because the big other of language stands between them as a third party. Between male and female human beings, there is no such thing as an instinctive relationship, because all sexuality is marked by the signifier. One consequence of this is that it is not possible to define perversion by reference to a supposedly natural form of the sexual relationship. Heterosexuality is thus not natural, but normative. 2. There is no reciprocity or symmetry between the male and female positions, because the symbolic order is fundamentally asymmetrical. There is no corresponding signifier which could signify woman in the same way that the male sex is symbolized. There is only one signifier, the phallus, which governs the relations between the sexes. There is thus no symbol for a symmetrical sexual relationship. The sexual relationship cannot be written. 3. Relations between men and women can never be harmonious. The most naked rivalry between men and women is eternal. Love is no more than an illusion designed to make up for the absence of harmonious relations between the sexes, whether presented in mythical terms as in Plato's Symposium, or in psychoanalytic terms as in Balince's concept of genital love. For the sexual drives are directed not towards a whole person, but towards part objects. There is therefore no such thing as a sexual relationship between two subjects, only between a subject and a partial object. For the man, the object petit a occupies the place of the missing partner, which produces the theme of fantasy. Subject Bart in congruence with object petit a, between brackets. In other words, the woman does not exist for the man as a real subject, but only as a fantasy object, the cause of his desire. 5. Woman cannot function sexually qua woman, but only qua mother. Woman begins to function in the sexual relationship only as mother. 6. As something rooted in the real, sex is opposed to meaning. And sex, in opposing itself to sense, is also, by definition, opposed to relation, to communication. Shifter. The term shifter was introduced into linguistics by Otto Jespersen in 1923 to refer to those elements in language whose general meaning cannot be defined without reference to the message. For example, the pronouns I and you, as well as the words like here and now, and the tenses can only be understood by reference to the context in which they are uttered. Roman Jacobson developed the concept in an article published in 1957. Before this article, the peculiarity of the personal pronoun and other shifters was often believed to consist in the lack of a single constant general meaning. Jacobson. In terms of Peirce's topology of science, shifters were treated as pure indices, see index. However, following Peirce's own argument, Jacobson argues that shifters do have a single general meaning. For example, the personal pronoun I always means the person uttering I. This makes the shifter a symbol. Jacobson concludes that shifters combine both symbolic and indexical functions and belong therefore to the class of indexical symbols. In this way, Jacobson questions the possibility of a context-free grammar since the enunciation is encoded in the statement itself. Also, since grammar is implicated in parole, the langue-parole distinction is also put into question. See Caton. Following Jacobson, Lacan uses the term shifter in English, or index term as he also calls it, to show the problematic and undecidable nature of the I, je. However, while Jacobson, following Peirce, defines the shifter as an indexical symbol, Lacan defines it as an indexical signifier. This problematizes the distinction between enunciation and statement. On the one hand, as a signifier it is clearly part of the statement. On the other hand, as an index it is clearly part of the enunciation. This division of the I is not merely illustrative of the splitting of the subject, it is that split. Indeed, the I of the enunciation is not the same as the I of the statement, that is to say, the shifter which in the statement designates him. Lacan also identifies the French particle ne as a shifter. Sign, signe. Lacan defines the sign as that which represents something for someone in opposition to the signifier, which is that which represents a subject for another signifier. By engaging with the concept of the sign, Lacan sets his work in close relation to the science of semiotics, which has grown rapidly in the 20th century. Two main lines of development can be discerned within semiotics: the European line associated with Ferdinand de Saussure, which Saussure himself baptized with the name of semiology, and the North American line associated with Charles S. Peirce. 1. According to Saussure, the sign is the basic unit of language, langue. The sign is constituted by two elements: a conceptual element, which Saussure calls the signified, and a phonological element, called the signifier. The two elements are linked by an arbitrary but unbreakable bond. Saussure represented the sign by means of a diagram. In this diagram, the arrows represent the reciprocal implications inherent in signification, and the line between the signified and the signifier represents union. Lacan takes up the Saussurean concept of the sign in his linguistic turn in psychoanalysis during the 1950s, but subjects it to several modifications. Firstly, whereas Saussure posited the reciprocal implication between the signifier and the signified, they are as mutually interdependent as two sides of a sheet of paper, Lacan argues that the relation between signifier and signified is extremely unstable. See slip. Secondly, Lacan asserts the existence of an order of pure signifiers, where signifiers exist prior to signifieds. This order of purely logical structure is the unconscious. This amounts to a destruction of Saussure's concept of the sign. For Lacan, language is not composed of signs but of signifiers. To illustrate the contrast between his own views and those of Saussure, above the bar capital S, below the bar small s. Lacan replaces Saussure's diagram of the sign with an algorithm, which Lacan argues should be attributed to Saussure, and is thus now sometimes referred to as the Saussurean algorithm. The capital S in figure 18 stands for the signifier, and the small s for the signified. The position of the signified and the signifier is thus inverted, showing the primacy of the signifier, which is capitalized, whereas the signifier is reduced to a mere lowercase italic. The arrows and the circle are abolished, representing the absence of a stable or fixed relation between signifier and signified. The bar between the signifier and the signified no longer represents union, but the resistance inherent in its signification. For Lacan, this algorithm defines the topography of the unconscious. 2. According to Peirce, the sign is something which represents an object to some interpretant. The term object can mean for Peirce a physical thing, an event, an idea, or another sign. Peirce divides signs into three classes: symbols, indices, and icons, which differ in the way they relate to the object. The symbol has no natural or necessary relationship to the object it refers to, but is related to the object by a purely conventional rule. The index has an existential relation to the object it represents. In other words, the index is always spatially or temporally contiguous to the object. The icon represents an object by exhibiting its form via similarity. Peirce's distinctions between icons, indices, and symbols are analytical and not intended to be mutually exclusive. Hence, a sign will almost always function in a variety of modes. Personal pronouns, for example, are signs which function both symbolically and indexically. Lacan takes up Peirce's concept of the index in order to distinguish between the psychoanalytic and medical concepts of the symptom and to distinguish between animal codes and human languages. Lacan also develops the concept of the index along the lines set down by Roman Jacobson in the concept of the shifter, to distinguish between the subject of the statement and the subject of the enunciation. Signification. In Lacan's pre-1950s writings, the term signification is used in a general way to connote both meaningfulness and importance. In 1946, for example, Lacan criticizes organicist psychiatry for ignoring the significations of madness. In the period 1953-1957, the term retains these vague associations with the realm of meaning and language, and is thus located in the symbolic order. It is from 1957 on that Lacan's use of the term takes on a direct reference to the Saussurean concept and shifts from the symbolic to the imaginary order. Saussure reserves the term signification for the relation between the signifier and the signified. Each sound image is said to signify a concept. Signification is, for Saussure, an unbreakable bond. The signifier and the signified are as inseparable as the two sides of a sheet of paper. Lacan argues that the relationship between signifier and signified is far more precarious. He sees the bar between them in the Saussurean algorithm as representing not a bond but a rupture, a resistance to signification. Firstly, the signifier is logically prior to the signified, which is merely an effect of the play of signifiers. Secondly, even when signifieds are produced, they constantly slip and slide underneath the signifier. The only things that detain this movement temporarily, pinning the signifier to the signified for a brief moment and creating the illusion of a stable meaning, are the point de capiton. Signification is, in Lacan's work, not a stable bond between signifier and signified, but a process. The process by which the play of signifiers produces the illusion of the signified via the two tropes of metonymy and metaphor. Signification is metonymic because signification always refers to another signification. In other words, meaning is not found in any one signifier, but in the play between signifiers along the signifying chain, and is therefore unstable. It is in the chain of the signifier that the meaning insists, but none of its elements consists in the signification of which it is at the moment capable. Signification is metaphoric because it involves the crossing of the bar, the passage of the signifier into the signified. The fundamental metaphor on which all signification depends is the paternal metaphor, and all signification is therefore phallic. Signification is designed by the symbol small s in Lacanian algebra, as in the notation small s between brackets capital A, which labels one of the main nodes in the graph of desire. The notation for the signified is also small s, which suggests that for Lacan the term signification, the process by which the effect of meaning is produced, and the term signified, the meaning of meaning itself, the effect of meaning itself, tend to overlap. In the late 1950s, Lacan establishes an opposition between signification and meaning, French sens. The variety of ways in which these terms have been translated into English provides difficulty for the English reader of Lacan. This dictionary follows the practice of rendering the French signification by the English term signification and reserves the English word meaning to translate the French term sens. Signification is imaginary and is the province of empty speech. Meaning is symbolic and is the province of full speech. Later, in the 1970s, Lacan locates meaning not in the symbolic order, but at the junction of the symbolic and the imaginary. See figure 1. Psychoanalytic interpretations go against signification and bear on meaning and its correlate non-meaning, non-sens. Although signification and meaning are opposed, they are both related to the production of jouissance. Lacan indicates this by coining two neologisms, signifiance, from the words signification and jouissance, and jouissance, from jouissance and sens. Signified, signifier. According to Saussure, the signified is the conceptual element of the sign. It is not the real object denoted by a sign, the referent, but a psychological entity corresponding to such an object. For Saussure, the signified has the same status as the signifier, both form equal sides of the sign. Lacan, on the other hand, asserts the supremacy of the signifier and argues that the signified is a mere effect of the play of signifiers, an effect of the process of signification produced by metaphor. In other words, the signified is not given but produced. Lacan's view is thus opposed to an expressionist view of language according to which concepts exist in some pre-verbal state before being expressed in the material medium of language. In contrast to such a view, Lacan asserts the priority, logical rather than chronological, of the material element of language. Signifier, signifiant. Lacan takes the term signifier from the work of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. The term was not used by Freud, who was unaware of Saussure's work. According to Saussure, the signifier is a phonological element of the sign, not the actual sound itself, but the mental image of such a sound. In Saussure's term, the signifier is the acoustic image, which signifies a signified. Whereas Saussure argues that the signifier and the signified are mutually interdependent, Lacan states that the signifier is primary and produces the signified. The signifier is first of all a meaningless material element in a closed differential system. This signifier without the signified is called by Lacan the pure signifier, though this is a question of logical rather than chronological precedence. Every real signifier is as such a signifier that signifies nothing. The more the signifier signifies nothing, the more indestructible it is. It is these meaningless, indestructible signifiers which determine the subject. The effects of the signifier on the subject constitute the unconscious, and hence also constitute the whole of the field of psychoanalysis. Thus for Lacan, language is not a system of signs as it was for Saussure, but a system of signifiers. Signifiers are the basic units of language, and they are subjected to the double condition of being reducible to ultimate differential elements and of combining according to the laws of a closed order. By the phrase reducible to ultimate differential elements, Lacan follows Saussure in asserting the fundamentally differential character of the signifier. Saussure states that in language there are no positive terms, only differences. By the phrase combining according to the laws of a closed order, Lacan asserts that signifiers are combined in signifying chains according to the laws of metonymy. The signifier is the constitutive unit of the symbolic order because it is integrally related with the concept of structure. The notion of structure and that of signifier appear inseparable. The field of the signifier is the field of the begotter, which Lacan calls the battery of signifiers. Lacan defines a signifier as that which represents a subject for another signifier, in opposition to the sign which represents something for someone. To be more precise, one signifier, called the master signifier and written capital S1, represents the subject for all other signifiers, written capital S2. However, no signifier can signify the subject. Although the term signifier is absent from Freud's work, Lacan's use of the term focuses attention on a recurrent theme in Freud's writings. Freud's examples of psychoanalytic interpretations constantly focus on purely formal linguistic features. For example, he analyzes his own failure to remember the name Signorelli by dividing the word into formal segments and following the associative links with each segment. Thus, Lacan's insistence that the analyst attend to the signifiers in the analysand's speech is not really an innovation in technique, but an attempt to theorize Freud's own method in more rigorous terms. While it is true that when Lacan talks about signifiers, he is often referring to what others would call simply words. The two terms are not equivalent. Not only can units of language smaller than words, morphemes and phonemes, or larger than words, phrases and sentences, also functions as signifiers, but so also can non-linguistic things such as objects, relationships, and symptomatic acts. The single condition which characterizes something as a signifier for Lacan is that it is inscribed in a system in which it takes on value purely by virtue of its difference from the other elements in the system. It is this differential nature of the signifier which means that it can never have a univocal or fixed meaning. On the contrary, its meaning varies according to the position which it occupies in the structure. Signifying chain. Chain signifiante. Chain du signifiant. The term chain is used increasingly by Lacan from the mid-1950s on, always in reference to the symbolic order. At first, in 1956, he speaks not of the signifying chain, but of the symbolic chain, by which he denotes a line of descendants into which each subject is inscribed even before his birth and after his death, and which influences his destiny unconsciously. In the same year he speaks of the chain of discourse. It is in 1957 that Lacan introduces the term signifying chain to refer to a series of signifiers which are linked together. A signifying chain can never be complete since it is always possible to add another signifier to it ad infinitum, in a way which expresses the eternal nature of desire. For this reason, desire is metonymic. The chain is also metonymic in the production of meaning. Signification is not present at any one point in the chain, but rather meaning insists in the movement from one signifier to another. At times, Lacan speaks of the signifying chain in linear metaphors, and at other times in circular metaphors. Linearity. The linearity that Saussure holds to be constitutive of the chain of discourse applies to the chain of discourse only in the direction in which it is orientated in time. Circularity. The signifying chain is compared to rings of a necklace that is a ring in another necklace made of rings. On the one hand, the idea of linearity suggests that the signifying chain is the stream of speech, in which signifiers are combined in accordance with the laws of grammar, which Saussure calls syntagmatic relationships, and Lacan, following Jacobson, locates on the metonymic axis of language. On the other hand, the idea of circularity suggests that the signifying chain is a series of signifiers linked by free associations, just one path through the network of signifiers, which constitutes the symbolic world of the subject, which Saussure designates associative relationships, and which Lacan, following Jacobson, locates on the metaphoric axis of language. In truth, the signifying chain is both of these things. In its diachronic dimension, it is linear, syntagmatic, metonymic. In its synchronic dimension, it is circular, associative, metaphoric. The two cross over. There is in effect no signifying chain, diachronic chain, that does not have, as if attached to the punctuation of each of its units, a whole articulation of relevant context, synchronic chains, suspended vertically as it were from that point. Lacan thus combines in one concept the two types of relationships, syntagmatic and associative, which Saussure argued existed between signs, though for Lacan the relationship is between signifiers, not signs. Symptôme. The term symptôme is, as Lacan points out, an archaic way of writing what has more recently been spelled symptôme. Lacan introduces the term in 1975 as the title for this 1975-1976 seminar, which is both a continuing elaboration of his topology, extending the previous seminars' focus on the Borromean knot, and an exploration of the writings of James Joyce. Through this coincidentia oppositorum, bringing together mathematical theory and the intricate weave of the Joycean text, Lacan redefines the psychoanalytic symptom in terms of his final topology of the subject. One, before the appearance of Saint-Thome, divergent currents in Lacan's thinking leads to different inflections of the concept of the Saint-Thome. As early as 1957, the symptom is said to be inscribed in a writing process, which already implies a different view to that which regards the symptom as a deciphered message. In 1963, Lacan goes on to state that the symptom, unlike acting out, does not call for interpretation in itself. It is not a call to the big other, but a pure jouissance addressed to no one. Such comments anticipate a radical transformation of Lacan's thought implicit in his shift from the linguistic definition of the symptom as a signifier to his statement in the 1974-75 seminar that the symptom can only be defined as the way in which each subject enjoys, jouit, the unconscious insofar as the unconscious determines him. This move from conceiving of the symptom as a message which can be deciphered by reference to the unconscious structured like a language to seeing it as the trace of the particular modality of the subject's response culminates in the introduction of the term Saint-Thome. The Saint-Thome thus designates a signifying formulation beyond analysis, a kernel of enjoyment immune to the efficacy of the symbolic. Far from calling for some analytic dissolution, the Saint-Thome is what allows one to live by providing a unique organization of response. The task of analysis thus becomes, in one of Lacan's last definitions of the end of analysis, to identify with the Saint-Thome. 2. The theoretical shift from linguistics to topology, which marks the final period of Lacan's work, constitutes the true status of the Saint-Thome as unanalyzable, and amounts to an exegetical problem beyond the familiar one of Lacan's dense rhetoric. The 1975-76 seminar extends the theory of the Borromean knot, which in the previous seminar had been proposed as the essential structure of the subject, by adding the Saint-Thome as a fourth ring to the triad of the real, the symbolic and the imaginary, tying together a knot which constantly threatens to come undone. This knot is not offered as a model, but as a rigorously non-metaphorical description of a topology before which the imagination fails. Since meaning, sens, is already figured within the knot, at the intersection of the symbolic and the imaginary, it follows that the function of the Saint-Thome intervening to knot together real, symbolic and imaginary is inevitably beyond meaning. 3. Lacan had been an enthusiastic reader of Joyce since his youth. See the references to Joyce. In the 1975-76 seminar, Joyce's writing is read as an extended Saint-Thome, a fourth term whose addition to the Borromean knot of the RSI allows the subject to cohere. Faced in his childhood by the radical non-function, absence, carence, of the name of the father, Joyce managed to avoid psychosis by deploying his art as suppléance, as a supplementary chord in the subjective knot. Lacan focuses on Joyce's youthful epiphanies, experiences of an almost hallucinatory intensity which were then recorded in enigmatic fragmentary text as instances of radical foreclosure, in which the real forecloses meaning. The Joycean text, from the Epiphany to Finnegan's Wake, entailed a special relation to language, a destructive refashioning of it as Saint-Thome, the invasion of the symbolic order by the subject's private jouissance. One of Lacan's puns, saint, synth, homme, implies this kind of artificial self-creation. Lacan's engagement with Joyce's writing does not, he insists, entail applied psychoanalysis. Topological theory is not conceived of as merely another kind of representational account, but as a form of writing, a praxis aiming to figure that which escapes the imaginary. To that extent, rather than a theoretical object or case, Joyce becomes an exemplary Saint-Homme, who, by refusing any imaginary solution, was able to invent a new way of using language to organize enjoyment. Author of this article, Luke Thurston. Slip, glisser, glissement. Lacan uses the verb slip and its correspondent noun, slippage, to describe the unstable relationship between the signifier and the signified. The term thus emphasizes the different ways in which Saussure and Lacan conceive of signification. For Saussure, signification was a stable bond between signifier and signified, but for Lacan it is an unstable, fluid relationship. It is impossible to establish a stable one-to-one link between signifiers and signifieds. And Lacan symbolizes this by inscribing a bar between them in the Saussurean algorithm. The signified slips and slides under the bar of the Saussurean algorithm. The signified slips and slides under the bar of the Saussurean algorithm are in a continuous movement, a movement which is only temporarily detained by the points de capiton. When there are not enough points de capiton, as in the case in psychosis, the slippery movement of signification is endless and stable meanings dissolve altogether. Specular image, image spéculaire. When Lacan talks about the specular image, he is referring to the reflection of one's own body in the mirror, the image of oneself, which is simultaneously oneself and other, the little other. It is by identifying with the specular image that the human baby first begins to construct his ego in the mirror stage. Even when there is no real mirror, the baby sees its behavior reflected in the imitative gestures of an adult or another child. These imitative gestures enable the other person to function as a specular image. The human being is completely captivated by the specular image. This is the basic reason for the power of the imaginary in the subject, and explains why man projects this image of his body onto all other objects in the world around him. See Lacan, 1975, see Captation. There are certain things which have no specular image, which are not specularizable. These are the phallus, the erogenous zones, and objet petit a. Speech. Parole. The French term parole presents considerable difficulty to the English translator because it does not correspond to any one English word. In some contexts it corresponds to the English term speech, and in others it is best translated as word. Parole becomes one of the most important terms in Lacan's work from the early 1950s on. In his famous Rome's Discours, Lacan denounces the way that the role of speech in psychoanalysis had come to be neglected by contemporary psychoanalytic theory, and argues for a renewed focus on speech and language. Lacan's use of the term parole owes little to Saussure, whose opposition between parole and langue is replacing Lacan's work with the opposition between parole and langage, and is far more determined by references to anthropology, theology, and metaphysics. Anthropology. Lacan's concept of speech as a symbolic exchange which links human beings to each other is clearly influenced by the work of Mauss and Levi-Strauss, especially their analysis of the exchange of gifts. Thus, Freud's interpretations are described as a symbolic gift of speech pregnant with a secret pact. The concept of speech as a pact which assigns roles to both the addressee and the addresser is formulated in Lacan's concept of founding speech. Theology. Speech also takes on religious and theological connotation in Lacan's work, in terms derived both from Eastern religions and the Judeo-Christian tradition. In 1954, Lacan discusses speech with reference to St. Augustine's De Locutionis Significatione. Like the words uttered by God in Genesis, speech is a symbolic invocation which creates ex nihilo a new order of being in the relations between men. Metaphysics. Lacan draws on Heidegger's distinction between Rede, discourse, and Gerede, chatter, to elaborate his own distinction between full speech, parole pleine, and empty speech, parole vide. Lacan first makes this distinction in 1953, and though it no longer plays an important part in his work after 1955, it never disappears completely. Full speech articulates the symbolic dimension of language, whereas empty speech articulates the imaginary dimension of language, the speech from the ego to the counterpart. Full speech is a speech full of meaning, sens. Empty speech is a speech which has only signification. Full speech is also called true speech, since it is closer to the enigmatic truth of the subject's desire. Full speech is speech which aims at, which forms the truth such as it becomes established in the recognition of one person by another. Full speech is speech which performs, qui fait acte. Full speech in effect is defined by its identity with that which it speaks about. In empty speech, on the other hand, the subject is alienated from his desire. In empty speech, the subject seems to be talking in vain about someone who can never become one with the assumption of his desire. One of the analyst's tasks when listening to the analysant is to discern the moments when full speech emerges. Full speech and empty speech are the extreme points on a continuum, and between these two extremes a whole gamut of modes of realization of speech is deployed. The aim of psychoanalytic treatment is to articulate full speech, which is hard work. Full speech can be quite laborious, pénible to articulate. Empty speech is not the same as lying. On the contrary, lies often reveal the truth about desire more fully than many honest statements. It is never possible to articulate in speech the whole truth of one's desire because of a fundamental incompatibility between desire and speech. I always tell the truth, not the whole truth, because we are not capable of telling it all. Telling it all is materially impossible. Full speech, then, is not the articulation in speech of the whole truth about the subject's desire, but the speech which articulates this truth as fully as possible at a particular time. Speech is the only means of access to the truth about desire. Speech alone is the key to that truth. Moreover, psychoanalytic theory claims that it is only a particular kind of speech that leads to this truth, a speech without conscious control, known as free association. Split, refond. Freud talks about the splitting of the ego, Ich-Gespaltung, Ich-Spaltung, clivage du moi, as a process observable in fetishism and psychosis, whereby two contradictory attitudes to reality come to exist side by side in the ego, those of acceptance and disavowal. Lacan amplifies the concept of Spaltung, which he prefers to translate by the term refond, to designate not a process unique to fetishism or psychosis, but a general characteristic of subjectivity itself. The subject can never be anything other than divided, split, alienated from himself. See alienation. The split is irreducible, can never be healed. There is no possibility of synthesis. The split or divided subject is symbolized by the bar, which strikes through the capital S to produce the barred subject, as Bart. This split denotes the impossibility of the ideal of a fully present self-consciousness. The subject will never know himself completely, but will always be cut off from his own knowledge. It thus indicates the presence of the unconscious and is an effect of the signifier. The subject is split by the very fact that he is a speaking being, since speech divides the subject of the enunciation from the subject of the statement. In his seminar of 1964-65, Lacan theorizes the split subject in terms of a division between truth and knowledge, savoir. Structure, structure. When Lacan uses the term structure in his early work of the 1930s, it is to refer to social structures, by which he means a specific set of affective relations between family members. The child perceives these relations much more profoundly than the adult and internalizes them in the complex. The term serves as a peg upon which Lacan can hang his own views of the relational nature of the psyche, in opposition to the atomistic theories then current in psychology. From this point on, the term structure retains this sense of something both intersubjective and intrasubjective, the internal representation of interpersonal relations. This remains a key point throughout Lacan's work, in which the emphasis on structure is a constant reminder that what determines the subject is not some supposed essence, but simply his position with respect to other subjects and other signifiers. Already in 1938, we find Lacan arguing that the most notable defect of analytic doctrine at that time was that it tended to ignore structure in favor of a dynamic approach. This anticipates his later emphasis on the symbolic order as the realm of structure which analysts have ignored in favor of the imaginary. Social structures are symbolic. In the mid-1950s, when Lacan begins to reformulate his ideas in terms borrowed from Saussurean structural linguistics, the term structure comes to be increasingly associated with Saussure's model of language. Saussure analyzed language, la langue, as a system in which there are no positive terms, only differences. It is this concept of a system in which each unit is constituted purely by virtue of its differences from the other units, which comes to constitute the core meaning of the term structure in Lacan's work from this point on. Lacan is the paradigmatic structure, and Lacan's famous dictum, the unconscious is structured like a language, is therefore tautologous, since to be structured and to be like a language mean the same thing. Saussure's structural approach to linguistics was developed further by Roman Jacobson, who developed phoneme theory. Jacobson's work was then taken up by the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who used a structural phonemic model to analyze non-linguistic cultural data such as kinship relations and myth. This application of structural analysis to anthropology launched the structuralist movement by showing how the Saussurean concept of structure could be applied to an object of inquiry other than language. Lacan was heavily influenced by all three of these thinkers, and in this sense, he can be seen as part of the structuralist movement. However, Lacan prefers to dissociate himself from this movement, arguing that his approach differs in important ways from the structuralist approach. Alongside the references to language, Lacan also refers the concept of structure to mathematics, principally to set theory and topology. In 1956, for example, he states that a structure is in the first place a group of elements forming a covariant set. 2 years later, he again links the concept of structure with mathematical set theory and adds a reference to topology. By the 1970s, topology has replaced language as the principal paradigm of structure for Lacan. He now argues that topology is not a mere metaphor for structure, it is that structure itself. The concept of structure is often taken to imply an opposition between surface and depth, between directly observable phenomena and deep structures, which are not the object of immediate experience. Such would seem to be the opposition implied in the distinction Lacan draws between symptoms, surface, and structures, depth. However, Lacan does not in fact agree that such an opposition is implicit in the concept of structure. On the one hand, he rejects the concept of directly observable phenomena, arguing that observation is always already theoretical. On the other hand, he also rejects the idea that structures are somehow deep or distant from experience, arguing that they are present in the field of experience itself. The unconscious is on the surface, and looking for it in the depths is to miss it. As with many other binary oppositions, the model Lacan prefers is that of the Möbius strip. Just as the two sides of the strip are in fact continuous, so structure is continuous with phenomena. The most important feature of structural analysis is not then any supposed distinction between surface and depth, but as Lévi-Strauss shows in his structural analysis of myth, the discovery of fixed relations between loci which are themselves empty. In other words, whatever elements may be placed in the position specified by a given structure, the relations between the positions themselves remain the same. Thus the elements interact not on the basis of any inherent or intrinsic properties they possess, but simply on the basis of the positions which they occupy in the structure. In line with many other psychoanalysts, Lacan distinguishes three principal nosographic categories: neurosis, psychosis, and perversion. His originality lies in the fact that he regards these categories as structures rather than simply as collections of symptoms. Lacan prefers to speak in terms of Freudian structures rather than clinical structures, but the latter term is the one which predominates in the writings of Lacanian psychoanalysts today. Lacanian nosography is a categorical classification system based on a discrete series rather than a dimensional system based on a continuum. The three major clinical structures are therefore mutually exclusive. A subject cannot be both neurotic and psychotic, for example. The three major clinical structures together constitute all the three possible positions of the subject in relation to the big other. Every subject encountered in psychoanalytic treatment can therefore be diagnosed as either neurotic or psychotic or perverse. Each structure is distinguished by a different operation: neurosis by the operation of repression, perversion by the operation of disavowal, and psychosis by the operation of foreclosure. Lacan follows Freud in arguing that the classical method of psychoanalytic treatment involving free association and the use of the couch is only appropriate for neurotic subjects and perverse subjects, and not for psychotics. Thus, when Lacanian analysts work with psychotic patients, they use a substantially modified method of treatment. One of the most fundamental axioms of psychoanalysis is that the subject's clinical structure is determined by his experiences in the first years of life. In this sense, psychoanalysis is based on a critical period hypothesis. The first years of life are the critical periods in which the subject's structure is determined. Although it is now clear how long this critical period lasts, it is held that after this critical period the clinical structure is fixed forever and cannot be changed. Neither psychoanalytic treatment nor anything else can, for example, turn a psychotic into a neurotic. Within each of the three major clinical structures, Lacan distinguishes various subdivisions. For example, within the clinical structure of neurosis, he distinguishes two kinds of neurosis, obsessional neurosis and hysteria, and within the clinical structure of psychosis, he distinguishes between paranoia, schizophrenia, and manic depressive psychosis. Subject, sujet. The term subject is present from the very earliest of Lacan's psychoanalytic writings, and from 1945 on it occupies a central part in Lacan's work. This is a distinctive feature of Lacan's work, since the term does not constitute part of Freud's theoretical vocabulary, but is more associated with philosophical, legal, and linguistic discourses. In Lacan's pre-war papers, the term subject seems to mean no more than human being. The term is also used to refer to the analysant. In 1945, Lacan distinguishes between three kinds of subject. Firstly, there is the impersonal subject, independent of the other, the pure grammatical subject, the noetic subject, the it of it is known that. Secondly, there is the anonymous reciprocal subject, who is completely equal to and substitutable for any other, and who recognizes himself in equivalence with the other. Thirdly, there is the personal subject, whose uniqueness is constituted by an act of self-affirmation. It is always this third sense of the subject in his uniqueness, that constitutes the focus of Lacan's work. In 1953, Lacan establishes a distinction between the subject and the ego, which will remain one of the most fundamental distinctions throughout the rest of his work. Whereas the ego is part of the imaginary order, the subject is part of the symbolic. Thus, the subject is not simply equivalent to a conscious sense of agency, which is a mere illusion produced by the ego, but to the unconscious. Lacan's subject is the subject of the unconscious. Lacan argues that this distinction can be traced back to Freud. Freud wrote Das Ich und das Es in order to maintain this fundamental distinction between the true subject of the unconscious and the ego as constituted in its nucleus by a series of alienating identifications. Although psychoanalytic treatment has powerful effects on the ego, it is the subject and not the ego on which psychoanalysis primarily operates. Lacan plays on the various meanings of the term subject. In linguistics and logic, the subject of a proposition is that about which something is predicated, and is also opposed to the object. Lacan plays on the philosophical nuances of the latter term to emphasize that his concept of the subject concerns those aspects of the human being that cannot or must not be objectified, reified, reduced to a thing, nor be studied in an objective way. What do we call a subject? Quite precisely, what in the development of objectivation is outside of the object. References to language come to dominate Lacan's concept of the subject from the mid-1950s on. He distinguishes the subject of the statement from the subject of the enunciation to show that because the subject is essentially a speaking being, par l'être, he is inescapably divided, castrated, split. In the early 1960s, Lacan defines the subject as that which is represented by a signifier for another signifier. In other words, the subject is an effect of language. Besides its place in linguistics and logic, the term subject also has philosophical and legal connotations. In philosophical discourse, it denotes an individual's self-consciousness, whereas in legal discourse, it denotes a person who is under the power of another, for example, a person who is subject to the sovereign. The fact that the term possesses both these meanings means that it perfectly illustrates Lacan's thesis about the determination of consciousness by the symbolic order. The subject is a subject only by virtue of his subjection to the field of the big other. The term also functions in legal discourse to designate the support of action. The subject is one who can be held responsible for his acts. The philosophical connotations of the term are particularly emphasized by Lacan, who links it with Descartes' philosophy of the cogito. In the term subject, I am not designating the living substratum needed by this phenomenon of the subject, nor any sort of substance, nor any being possessing knowledge in his pathos, nor even some incarnated logos, but the Cartesian subject who appears at the moment when doubt is recognized as certainty. The fact that the symbol of the subject, capital S, is a homophone of the Freud's term es, see id, illustrates that for Lacan the true subject is the subject of the unconscious. In 1957, Lacan strikes through this symbol to produce the symbol S-Bart, the Bart subject, thus illustrating the fact that the subject is essentially divided. Subject supposed to know. Sujet supposé savoir. The term sujet supposé savoir, often abbreviated to as capital S, small s, capital S, is difficult to translate into English. Sheridan translates it as supposed, subject supposed, with 3 P's, to know. And this is the translation adopted in most English works on Lacan. However, Schneiderman suggests the alternative translation supposed subject of knowledge, on the grounds that it is the subject, not just the knowledge, which is supposed. The phrase is introduced by Lacan in 1961 in order to designate the illusion of a self-consciousness, German Selbstbewusstsein, which is transparent to itself in its act of knowing, see consciousness. This illusion, which is born in the mirror stage, is put into question by psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis demonstrates that knowledge, savoir, cannot be located in any particular subject, but is in fact intersubjective. In 1964, Lacan takes up the phrase in his definition of transference as the attribution of knowledge to a subject. As soon as the subject who is supposed to know exists somewhere, there is transference. This definition emphasizes that it is the analysant's supposition of a subject who knows that initiates the analytic process, rather than the knowledge actually possessed by the analyst. The term subject supposed to know does not designate the analyst himself, but a function which the analyst may come to embody in the treatment. It is only when the analyst is perceived by the analysant to embody this function that the transference can be said to be established. When this occurs, what kind of knowledge is it that the analyst is presumed to possess? He is supposed to know that from which no one can escape as soon as he formulates it, quite simply, signification. In other words, the analyst is often thought to know the secret meaning of the analysant's words, the significations of speech of which even the speaker is unaware. This supposition alone, the supposition that the analyst is one who knows, causes otherwise insignificant details, chance gestures, ambiguous remarks to acquire retroactively a special meaning for the patient who supposes. It may happen that the patient supposes the analyst to be a subject who knows from the very first moment of the treatment or even before, but it often takes some time for the transference to become established. In the latter case, when the subject enters the analysis, he is far from giving the analyst this place of the subject supposed to know. The analysant may initially regard the analyst as a buffoon or may withhold information from him in order to maintain his ignorance. However, even the psychoanalyst put in question is credited at some point with a certain infallibility. Sooner or later, some chance gesture of the analyst's is taken by the analysant as a sign of some secret intention, some hidden knowledge. At this point, the analyst has come to embody the subject supposed to know. The transference is established. The end of analysis comes when the analysant desupposes the analyst of knowledge, so that the analyst falls from the position of the subject supposed to know. The term subject supposed to know also emphasizes the fact that it is a particular relationship to knowledge that constitutes the unique position of the analyst. The analyst is aware that there is a split between him and the knowledge attributed to him. In other words, the analyst must realize that he only occupies the position of one who is presumed by the analysant to know, without fooling himself that he really does possess the knowledge attributed to him. The analyst must realize that of the knowledge attributed to him by the analysant, he knows nothing. However, the fact that it is a supposed knowledge that is the mainstay of the analytic process rather than the knowledge actually possessed by the analyst does not mean that the analyst can therefore be content with knowing nothing. On the contrary, Lacan argues that analysts should emulate Freud in becoming experts in cultural, literary, and linguistic methods. Lacan also remarks that for the analyst is a subject supposed to know. When the analyst explains the fundamental role of free association to the analysant, he is effectively saying, come on, say anything, it will all be marvelous. In other words, the analyst tells the analysant to behave as if he knew what it was all about, thereby instituting him as a subject supposed to know. Sublimation, sublimation. In Freud's work, sublimation is a process in which the libido is channeled into apparently non-sexual activities such as artistic creation and intellectual work. Sublimation thus functions as a socially acceptable escape valve for excess sexual energy, which would otherwise have to be discharged in socially unacceptable forms, perverse behavior, or in neurotic symptoms. The logical conclusion of such a view is that complete sublimation would mean the end of all perversion and all neurosis. However, many points remain unclear in Freud's account of sublimation. Lacan takes up the concept of sublimation in his seminar of 1959-1960. He follows Freud in emphasizing the fact that the element of social recognition is central to the concept, since it is only insofar as the drives are diverted towards socially valued objects that they can be said to be sublimated. It is this dimension of shared social values which allows Lacan to tie in the concept of sublimation with his discussion of ethics. However, Lacan's account of sublimation also differs from Freud's on a number of points. 1. Freud's account implies that perverse sexuality as a form of direct satisfaction of the drive is possible, and that sublimation is only necessary because this direct form is prohibited by society. Lacan, however, rejects the concept of a zero degree of satisfaction, sees Zizek, arguing that perversion not simply a brute natural means of discharging the libido, but a highly structured relation to the drives which are already in themselves linguistic rather than biological forces. Again, Lacan, however, rejects the concept of a zero degree of satisfaction, arguing that perversion not simply a brute natural means of discharging the libido, but a highly structured relation to the drives which are already in themselves linguistic rather than biological forces. 2. Whereas Freud believed that complete sublimation might be possible for some particularly refined or cultured people, Lacan argues that complete sublimation is not possible for the individual. 3. In Freud's account, sublimation involves the redirection of the drive to a different non-sexual object. In Lacan's account, however, what changes is not the object but its position in the structure of fantasy. In other words, sublimation does not involve directing the drive to a different object, but rather changing the nature of the object to which the drive was already directed. A change of object in itself, something which is made possible because the drive is already deeply marked by the articulation of the signifier. The sublime quality of an object is thus not due to any intrinsic property of the object itself, but simply an effect of the object's position in the symbolic structure of fantasy. To be more specific, sublimation relocates an object in the position of the thing. The Lacanian formula for sublimation is thus that it raises an object to the dignity of the thing. For while Lacan follows Freud in linking sublimation with creativity and art, he complicates this by also linking it with the death drive. Several reasons can be adduced to explain this. Firstly, the concept of the death drive is itself seen as a product of Freud's own sublimation. Secondly, the death drive is not only a destruction drive, but also a will to create from zero. Thirdly, the sublime object, though through being elevated to the dignity of the thing, exerts a power of fascination which leads ultimately to death and destruction. Suggestion. In 19th century French psychiatry, the term suggestion referred to the use of hypnosis to remove neurotic symptoms. While the patient was in a state of hypnosis, the doctor would suggest that the symptoms would disappear. Taking his cue from the French psychiatrists Charcot and Bernheim, Freud began using suggestion to treat neurotic patients in the 1880s. However, he became increasingly dissatisfied with suggestion and thus came to abandon hypnosis and develop psychoanalysis. The reasons for Freud's dissatisfaction with hypnosis are hence fundamental for understanding the specific nature of psychoanalysis. However, it is beyond the scope of this article to enter into a detailed discussion of these reasons. Suffice it to say that in Freud's later work, the term suggestion comes to represent a whole set of ideas which Freud associates with hypnosis and which is thus diametrically opposed to psychoanalysis. Following Freud, Lacan uses the term suggestion to designate a whole range of deviations from true psychoanalysis, deviations which Lacan also refers to as psychotherapy, of which the following are perhaps the most salient. 1. Suggestion includes the idea of directing the patient towards some ideal or some moral value, see ethics. In opposition to this, Lacan reminds analysts that their task is to direct the treatment, not the patient. Lacan is opposed to any conception of psychoanalysis as a normative process of social influence. 2. Suggestion also arises when the patient's resistance is seen as something that must be liquidated by the analyst. Such a view is completely foreign to psychoanalysis, argues Lacan, since the analyst recognizes that a certain residue of resistance is inherent in the structure of the treatment. 3. In suggestion, the interpretations of the therapist are orientated around signification, whereas the analyst orientates his interpretations around meaning, sens, and its correlate, nonsense. Thus, whereas in psychotherapy there is an attempt to avoid the ambiguity and equivocation of discourse, it is precisely this ambiguity which psychoanalysis thrives on. Suggestion has a close relation with transference. If transference involves the analysand attributing knowledge to the analyst, suggestion refers to a particular way of responding to this attribution. Lacan argues that the analyst must realize that he only occupies the position of one who is presumed by the analysand to know, without fooling himself that he really does possess the knowledge attributed to him. In this way, the analyst is able to transform the transference into an analysis of suggestion. Suggestion, on the other hand, arises when the analyst assumes the position of one who really does know. Like Freud, Lacan sees hypnosis as the model of suggestion. In group psychology and the analysis of the ego, Freud shows how hypnotism makes the object converge with the ego ideal. To put this in Lacanian terms, hypnotism involves the convergence of the objectivity and the I. Psychoanalysis involves exactly this opposite, since the fundamental mainspring of the analytic operation is the maintenance of the distance between I, identification, and the objectivity. Superego, surmoi. The term superego does not appear until quite late in Freud's work, being first introduced in The Ego and the It, Freud. It was in this work that Freud introduced his so-called structural model, in which the psyche is divided into three agencies, the ego, the it, and the superego. However, the concept of a moral agency which judges and censors the ego can be found in Freud's work long before he locates these functions in the superego, such as in his concept of censorship. Lacan's first discussion of the superego comes in his article on the family. In this work, he distinguishes clearly between the superego and the ego ideal, terms which Freud seems to use interchangeably in the ego and the it. He argues that the primary function of the superego is to repress sexual desire for the mother in the resolution of the Oedipus complex. Following Freud, he argues that the superego results from Oedipal identification with the father, but he also refers to Melanie Klein's thesis on the maternal origins of an archaic form of the superego. When Lacan returns to the subject of the superego in 1953-54 seminar, he locates it in the symbolic order as opposed to the imaginary order of the ego. The superego is essentially located within the symbolic plane of speech. The superego has a close relationship with the law, but this relationship is a paradoxical one. On the one hand, the law as such is a symbolic structure which regulates subjectivity and in this sense prevents disintegration. On the other hand, the law of the superego has a senseless blind character of pure imperativeness and simple tyranny. Thus the superego is at once and at the same time the law and its destruction. The superego arises from the misunderstanding of the law, from the gaps in the symbolic chain, and fills out those gaps with an imaginary substitute that distorts the law. See Lacan's almost identical remarks on censorship. Censorship is always related to whatever in discourse is linked to the law insofar as it is not understood. More specifically, in linguistic terms, the superego is an imperative. In 1962, Lacan argues that this is none other than the Kantian categorical imperative. The specific imperative involved is the command, enjoy. The superego is the big other insofar as the big other commands the subject to enjoy. The superego is thus the expression of the will to enjoy, volonté de jouissance, which is not the subject's own will, but the will of the big other, who assumes the form of Said's supreme being in evil. The superego is an obscene, ferocious figure, which imposes a senseless, destructive, purely oppressive, almost always anti-legal morality on the neurotic subject. The superego is related to the voice and thus to the invoking drive and to sadism and masochism. Symbolic. The term symbolic appears in adjectival form in Lacan's earliest psychoanalytic writings. In these early works, the term implies references to symbolic logic and to the equations used in mathematical physics. In 1948, symptoms are said to have a symbolic meaning. The term has acquired anthropological overtones, as when Lacan praises Marcel Mauss for having shown that the structures of society are symbolic. These different nuances are combined into a single category in 1953 when Lacan begins to use the term symbolic as a noun. It now becomes one of the three orders that remain central throughout the rest of Lacan's work. Of these three orders, the symbolic is the most crucial one for psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysts are essentially practitioners of the symbolic function. In speaking of the symbolic function, Lacan makes it clear that his concept of the symbolic order owes much to the anthropological work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, from whom the phrase symbolic function is taken. See Lévi-Strauss. In particular, Lacan takes from Claude Lévi-Strauss the idea that the social world is structured by certain laws which regulate kinship relations and exchange of gifts. See also Mauss 1923. The concept of the gift and that of a circuit of exchange are thus fundamental to Lacan's concept of the symbolic. Since the most basic form of exchange is communication itself, the exchange of words, the gift of speech, and since the concepts of law and structure are unthinkable without language, the symbolic is essentially a linguistic dimension. Any aspect of the psychoanalytic experience which has a linguistic structure thus pertains to the symbolic order. However, Lacan does not simply equate the symbolic order with language. On the contrary, language involves imaginary and real dimensions in addition to its symbolic dimension. The symbolic dimension of language is that of the signifier, a dimension in which elements have no positive existence, but which are constituted purely by virtue of their mutual differences. The symbolic is also the realm of radical alterity, which Lacan refers to as the big other or the other. The unconscious is the discourse of this big other and thus belongs wholly to the symbolic order. The symbolic is the realm of the law, which regulates desire in the Oedipus complex. It is the realm of culture as opposed to the imaginary order of nature. Whereas the imaginary is characterized by dual relations, the symbolic is characterized by triadic structures because the intersubjective relationship is always mediated by a third term, the big other. The symbolic order is also the realm of death, of absence, and of lack. The symbolic is both the pleasure principle, which regulates the distance from the thing, and the death drive, which goes beyond the pleasure principle by means of repetition. In fact, the death drive is only the mask of the symbolic order. The symbolic order is completely autonomous. It is not a superstructure determined by biology or genetics. It is completely contingent with respect to the real. There is no biological reason and, in particular, no genetic one to account for exogamy. In the human order, we are dealing with a complete emergence of a new function encompassing the whole order in its entirety. Thus, while the symbolic may seem to spring from the real as pre-given, this is an illusion, and one shouldn't think that symbols actually have come from the real. The totalizing, all-encompassing effect of the symbolic order leads Lacan to speak of the symbolic as a universe. In the symbolic order, the totality is called a universe. The symbolic order from the first takes on its universal character. It isn't constituted bit by bit. As soon as the symbol arrives, there is a universe of symbols. There is therefore no question of a gradual, continuous transition from the imaginary to the symbolic. There are completely heterogeneous domains. Once the symbolic order has arisen, it creates the sense that it has always been there, since we find it absolutely impossible to speculate on what preceded it other than by symbols. For this reason, it is strictly speaking impossible to conceive the origin of language, let alone what came before, which is why questions of development lie outside the field of psychoanalysis. Lacan criticizes the psychoanalysis of his day for forgetting the symbolic order and reducing everything to the imaginary. This is, for Lacan, nothing less than a betrayal of Freud's most basic insights. Freud's discovery is that of the field of the effects in the nature of man produced by his relation to the symbolic order. To ignore this symbolic order is condemn the discovery to oblivion. Lacan argues that it is only by working in the symbolic order that the analyst can produce changes in the subjective position of the analysant. These changes will also produce imaginary effects, since the imaginary is structured by the symbolic. It is the symbolic order which is determinant of subjectivity, and the imaginary realm of images and appearances are merely effects of the symbolic. Psychoanalysis must therefore penetrate beyond the imaginary and work in the symbolic order. Lacan's concept of the symbolic is diametrically opposed to Freud's symbolism. For Freud, the symbol was a relatively fixed bi-univocal relation between meaning and form, which corresponds more to the Lacanian concept of the index. For Lacan, however, the symbolic is characterized by the absence of any fixed relations between signifier and signified. Symptom. In medicine, symptoms are the perceptible manifestations of an underlying illness that might otherwise remain undetected. The concept of the symptom is thus predicated on a basic distinction between surface and depth, between phenomena, objects which can be directly experienced, and the hidden causes of those phenomena, which cannot be experienced but must be inferred. A similar distinction operates in Lacan's work, in which symptoms are always distinguished from structures. This distinction has the advantage of transcending the opposition between surface and depth, since structures are held to be just as much on the surface as the symptoms themselves. It is the clinical structure of the patient, neurosis, psychosis, or perversion, which constitutes the real focus of psychoanalysis and not his symptoms, and thus the end of analysis must be conceived of in structural terms rather than in terms of curing symptoms. In Lacan's work, the term symptom usually refers to neurotic symptoms, that is, to the perceptible manifestations of neurosis, and not to manifestations of the other clinical structures. But see E281 for an exception. Hence, the manifestations of psychosis, such as hallucinations and delusions, are not usually referred to as symptoms but as phenomena, whereas perversion manifests itself in perverse acts. The aim of Lacanian psychoanalysis is not the removal of neurotic symptoms, since when one neurotic symptom disappears, it is often simply replaced by another. This is what distinguishes psychoanalysis from any form of therapy. Lacan follows Freud in affirming that neurotic symptoms are formations of the unconscious and that they are always a compromise between two conflicting desires. Lacan's originality lies in his understanding of neurotic symptoms in linguistic terms. The symptom revolves itself entirely in an analysis of language because this symptom is itself structured like a language. Over the course of his work, Lacan identifies the symptom with different features of language. One, in 1953, argues that the symptom is a signifier. This distinguishes the psychoanalytic concept of the symptom from the medical approach, in that the latter regards the symptom not as a signifier but as an index. One consequence of this distinction is that as far as psychoanalytic theory is concerned, there is no universal meaning for a neurotic symptom, since each symptom is a product of a particular subject's unique history. Despite their apparent similarities, all neurotic symptoms are unique. Another consequence is that there is no fixed one-to-one link between neurotic symptoms and the underlying neurotic structure. No neurotic symptom is in itself hysterical or obsessional. This means that whereas a doctor can arrive at a diagnosis on the basis of the symptoms presented by a patient, a Lacanian analyst cannot determine whether a neurotic patient is a hysteric or an obsessional simply on the basis of his symptoms. For example, the analyst will not diagnose a patient as obsessional simply because the patient presents typical obsessional symptoms, ritual, actions, compulsive behavior, etc. Conversely, the analyst may well attribute an obsessional structure to a patient who does not present any of the typical symptoms of obsessional neurosis. The Lacanian analyst can only arrive at the diagnosis of hysteria or obsessional neurosis by identifying the fundamental question that animates the neurotic's speech. In 1955, Lacan identifies the symptom with signification. The symptom is in itself through and through signification, that is to say, truth taking shape. 3. In 1957, the symptom is described as a metaphor, the symptom being a metaphor in which flesh or function is taken as a signifying element. Lacan means this description to be taken literally. If the symptom is a metaphor, it is not a metaphor to say so. 4. In the graph of desire, which first appears in the seminar of 1957-1958, this symptom is described as a message. In 1961, Lacan goes on to say that the symptom is an enigmatic message which the subject thinks is an opaque message from the real instead of recognizing it as his own message. From 1962 on, there is a gradual tendency in Lacan's work away from the linguistic conception of the symptom and towards a view of the symptom as pure jouissance, which cannot be interpreted. This conceptual shift culminates in 1975 with the introduction of the term symptôme.